All right, everybody. We are glad to be here tonight. My name is Jeff Hinckley.
And I am Jeremy Fisher.
We are super excited to get to be here with the community groups this evening, kicking off our series in Romans.
Yes, Romans, man. What a book.
Yeah,
what a book.
I love this. This is a quote from John Calvin. You probably heard it in today's message, but it just says that if a man understands it, talking about the book of Romans, if he understands it, he has a sure road open to him to the understanding of the whole of Scripture.
Ooh, that's a bold statement.
Quintessential book of the Bible.
Oh, quintessential. Okay.
Romans
big words.
Yeah, Romans is not one of those books, right, that if you're recommending books of the Bible to people to read, it's not one of those ones you want to skip. You know, there's some out there maybe that aren't as
Habakkuk or
I like Habakkuk.
I love Habakkuk too. Or Zephaniah.
Yeah. Hey, have you guys read Leviticus here recently? Right.
All of it's important, but for our understanding of the work of Jesus specifically, and as a New Testament believer, Romans is so important to our faith.
I love that. Yeah. So,
and not only understanding what we believe, but how we're to live it out.
Yeah, and that's what I think is so great about this series. As you heard today, this is one of those series where we're taking a really deep dive into the Scriptures, where you're going to learn not just some of the practical takeaways, but these are just some really formational theological concepts that you're going to get, where we're learning not just how to live our life, but also how to interact with God, how to interact with others. It's a big deal. Yeah. So I love the way that we started out just with Romans 1, kicking it off from the beginning, not going to miss out a moment. I love this here. It just says that Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God.
Ooh, there it is.
I love that. That's the way we begin this one. It's all about the gospel of God.
Yeah.
And, if you spent some time in church, you hear a ton about this word, gospel. You hear that it's all about the gospel of Jesus. It's all about the gospel of Christ. And I think that you can sort of hear it so much that it loses the flavor a little bit. But
man. And what always helps me is I go back to that moment when I realized the bad news, when God opened my eyes to the bad news of, man, I realize He's helping me see how sinful I have been and what the consequence of my sin is, what the penalty for my sin is. It's death. It's eternal separation from Him. Yeah. And when you feel the weight of that, and you feel like, man, I rightly deserve all of these things. God didn't make me run from Him.
Yeah, sure.
God didn't make, but hey, but when I felt the weight of those things, when I go back and then I remember the good news.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
When you take the word gospel, you go back to the Greek, the Hellenistic roots of it. It's the word euangelion, and it literally means
good news.
Good news. And I think this is just so telling when Jesus comes and preaches the good news, preaches the gospel, that when we first hear it, it's easy to think like, oh, we're sunk. We're in so much trouble, you know? Because it reveals just how sinful we are. And so before it's good news, I guess it's bad news a little bit.
And there can be this idea out there, I think, that when people who haven't grown up in the church, or maybe people who have grown up in the church, and there's this constant feeling of, hey, I'm falling short, and everyone else seems to have it together. Everyone else seems to, but for me, there's no way God could forgive me. There's no way that I could ever live up to this standard. But let me free you up here that Romans, that's what it's, the bad news is, hey, everyone's in the same boat. Like everyone's sinned.
We're all sunk.
Everyone's sunk. So we are all in the same boat, and there is only one hope. And that is Jesus.
And that's the good news.
Yes.
Is that He's done the work for us. And so, I remember as a kid, I don't know if you felt this way at all, but I remember when I was a kid thinking to myself that, I didn't pray enough, or that I didn't go to church enough. Ooh. My attendance wasn't perfect. And I remember literally just riding on the bus to school and thinking to myself about how I was never going to measure up. My youth pastor at the time seemed like such a holy, Christ-like figure.
Oh man, yeah. I remember I used to go to church with my parents, and my youth pastor, I felt like he would look at me at the end of the service. There was always this time where the youth pastor and the associate pastor would be up front for the response.
Yes. Yeah.
And the youth pastor, he's facing the crowd, and I always felt like he zeroed in
on
me.
you, right? Yeah, every single time. Yeah. And I remember just early on feeling like, man, I have fallen so short.
Yeah.
And if I could only get to where these guys are, and now being on the other side of it, I recognize that that's really still the truth, is I've still fallen short. But the good news is that Jesus has built a bridge for us. And so I think this is a great time right now for you and your CG to talk a little bit about the good news of Jesus, and maybe at first how you first encountered this good news. It's easy, I think, for us to get lost in what the gospel is. We hear about it so often. We hear this word so often. But why don't you take a second to just talk about the first time you heard the good news and why it seemed so good and so refreshing to you? Paul moves on from talking about who he was writing the letter to. Just as the narrative flow goes, he starts it out, he's talking about he's writing to this church in Rome. He's writing to the Christians over there. People are hearing about their faith left and right. And he goes on, he says this, "For I long to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to strengthen you. That is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine." And I think this is really cool here. It's interesting to note that the spiritual gift that Paul is talking about here is encouragement.
Yeah.
And and when I think about spiritual gifts, sometimes it's like speaking in tongues, evangelism, is like preaching, leadership, you know. But he talks about that the spiritual gift that he wants to gain, to impart, is encouragement.
Encouragement, man.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think too, I read this, and you just read through chapter 1, and you see that Paul is really desiring to be with the people in Rome. He really wants to be with the believers in Rome. And I love in this passage, he's talking about his desire to impart encouragement with them, like to be with them. And I think that this leads to a whole nother conversation on how we encourage people and be with them as we encourage. And presence is so important.
Yeah.
And it's easy, you know, when someone has a need for us to just hop on Facebook and, oh man so praying for you or texting you, but it's a whole nother thing to go the extra mile and actually go visit that person or go be with them. And some people just leave that to the pastor, but I think here at Sea Life we have a great community of people who desire to be with one another and encourage each other through difficult things. Yeah,
and you know, when I think about encouragement, particularly among guys, I think encouragement is one of those things that's like, you know, I don't want to come across as weak, or, you know, it seems like it's sometimes it's more of a, you know, females are good at it.
Right.
What's the stigma with encouragement? What's the problem with that?
I really do believe that, and this is just, I think it is a weakness thing. It's an unwillingness to maybe be vulnerable. It just shows like an opening up that may feel uncomfortable to some men, but hey, God wants us to lead in encouragement. Men should be the best encouragers, and you know, the best encouragers I know for the most part are women. Yeah. Because they're used to and okay with and more willing oftentimes to open up and be vulnerable and lead in that.
And you know, guys' form of encouragement, like I've had 100 coaches growing up, you know, hey, good game. You know, they let you know. That's their version of it, right?
It's just the pat on the shoulder.
And you're like, okay, you know, I think he really likes me. I think he's really proud of me right now.
Use your words when you encourage.
Use your words. Yeah. I tell my 3-year-old this all the time. You know, use your words. And encouragement is naturally, it's like a verbal kind of thing. And, you know, I just think to myself about the leaders I've served under that have the gift of encouragement. And, you know, one in particular that at the last place I worked was just an incredible leader when it came to encouragement. Every time I was around him, I always felt like the fire of my heart was stoked, and he was so happy to see me every single time, so proud of me, and he let me know. He was always very good about it. And then, you know, we had a leadership change, and I had another leader that came in above me who did not have that gift, but he was probably a little bit more leadership savvy, probably had a better knowledge of the scriptures. He was the kind of person that, you know, was a good preacher, you know, by all accounts, was very gifted. but lacked that gift of encouragement. And I'll tell you what, man, I worked harder, I worked longer, I worked smarter, faster, better under the previous leader than I did under, the big shot. And so I just think it's so interesting when you look at how valuable encouragement is. It really is a spiritual gift to gain and to give.
It is, and I think too, there's another side of that. For people who maybe are more bent towards encouragement, you can wonder maybe what's too much, what's not enough, what's just around. Because there comes a point, I feel like, where we're leaning on flattery, or encouragement.
Yeah.
And we were kind of talking about this, the difference between what's the difference between flattery and encouragement. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to flattery is about you, is about how the person perceives you. And encouragement is solely focused on building up the person that's being spoken to.
That's good.
And at the end of the day, to encourage them to trust in Jesus, to hope in Jesus, to be encouraged by His Word. And so, I think that there's a fine line between, encouraging,
no doubt,
and then flattery as well that we have to walk.
So why don't you take this time now to talk a little bit about what is so weird about encouragement? Why is it that we don't give it? Why is it that we hold on to words that we know are truthful and would build another person up? What's so difficult about encouragement? And then finally, Paul wraps up the portion that we talked about in our service earlier, where he just says this, that I don't want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far I've been prevented. And, Paul could be referring to a lot of things here on why he never made it out to Rome. I think of in Acts, Paul mentions why he doesn't go to Asia, that the Spirit had prevented him. And that may be the case here. Maybe Paul was prevented by the Spirit. Maybe there were circumstances. Maybe he was ill or didn't have the money or the funds. But he makes it really clear that he had intended to go, he wanted to go, and just couldn't make it out there. Paul could be referring to a ton of things here, but I think maybe the lesson to pull from this is, sometimes the timing isn't always there for things that we want to come around in our life. And we may have good intentions, and we've got all the desire in the world to make it out there, but God is the one that opens and closes the doors,
It could be something that seems like, man, this is a good thing, maybe, God, that you would want. You would maybe want Paul to be there with the believers in Rome to share the gospel, to impart this encouragement. Like, this seems like something, God, you would want, but for whatever reason, this comes down to just trusting God. But for whatever reason, Paul realizes it's not Satan.
Right. We blame everything on Satan.
It's all Satan, No, it's not Satan that
was the devil.
It's not Satan that was preventing him. It was the Spirit of God. And we know that all the doors, open, closed, are in God's control. And we can trust that, if there is something we want to do, something we desire, even if it is a good thing, it may just not be the right time, or God may have something better. And so it just comes down. It's a good way to put it. It just comes down to trusting.
It's a great way to
God.
put it. And I just kind of add. I look at the life of my son, who I've mentioned here before, and just getting to speak at different campuses. And my son deals with something within autism called perseveration. And the idea behind perseveration is that there's a certain order to things, and if something gets out of order, it really throws them off real bad. And I think that's probably the case with a lot of us in a spiritual sense, where it's like there's an order to this. God, I can see Z. I'm starting at A. How do I fill in the gaps in between? And trying to answer those questions. And you may have good intentions. There's things that you want. There's things that you desire. But sometimes God just has something different or something better on the other end of it.
And that's the thing too, is, and we talked about this, is contentment is a huge piece of this, that there's this desire for Paul to go and do this, but then he realizes, you know what, God has me where He has me, and I'm just going to be content.
Right here.
And a lot of the times, I think that we think that maybe a different set of circumstances is what is going to get us, what's going to fix things, or we hop out of something because we feel like okay, that door's closed, and we get kind of we get frustrated or whatever, and so to fix things, we hop out of the difficult circumstance rather than, God may be wanting us to stay in it, to teach us a lot and to use us. And so I think that contentment, the secret to that, of course, is just Jesus. I can do all things through Christ, who gives me strength.
That's really good. Yeah. And so let's take this time to just wrap up our discussion right now. And I think you could end with this question. What are you waiting on right now? What is it that you're waiting for? What is it that you're hoping that God will either open or shut, something He'll order? What is it that you've maybe been prevented on carrying out that you're still waiting on God to deal with? Hey, thank you guys so much for joining us here today. We have loved spending this time with y'all. Have a great night.